Hello and welcome to the Research 101 podcast series by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. I am Jennifer Garner, outgoing chair of the Academy's Council on Research. This series will provide an overview of the research process and provide information on Academy research opportunities. You can earn 1.5 units of continuing professional education by listening to all 6 podcasts. During this 5th podcast, I will be interviewing Dr. Linda Snetselaar, who will provide advice on sharing research results. Dr. Snetselaar is Professor and Chair of Preventive Nutrition Education in the Department of Epidemiology, Director of the Nutrition Center, Co-Director of the Preventive Intervention Center, and Associate Provost of Outreach and Engagement at the University of Iowa. She is also currently the Editor-in-Chief for the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and her career has really been dedicated to higher learning and to research, and most notably, she has served as principal and co-principal investigator in National Institutes of Health studies, including the Diabetes Control and Complications Trial, the Modification of Diet in Renal Disease Study, the Diet Intervention Study in Children, the Women's Health Initiative, and the Women's Intervention Nutrition Study. She is currently involved in multiple sclerosis, dietary intervention research, and community-based participatory research studies. Dr. Snetselaar, thank you for sharing your time and experience with us today. My first question for you is, sharing the results of a research project is arguably one of the most important parts of the process. And so one of the primary ways that researchers do so typically is by publishing their findings in a research journal, such as the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So for any listeners who might be relatively new to this process, would you mind providing just a brief summary of the different types of publications that the journal accepts and the general process from submission to eventual publication, hopefully?
Yes, I would be happy to. We have a variety of types of papers, and we've divided them into groups because the kinds of research that one might do generally fall into different categories, all the way from a research paper, which for our journal could include randomized clinical trials. It could include prospective cohort studies, larger epidemiologic studies that include case control study designs, for example. And this type of research is usually considered from a study design point of view as probably one of the most scientifically rigorous. And so we are focusing on those for our research papers. We then secondly have research briefs. They are usually a bit shorter in length, and they may include pilot studies that might then eventually go on to being an actual research paper. We often, too, have many studies that are done that might have secondary analysis, where that primary hypothesis, which is what we would see in the research paper, is not necessarily a primary hypothesis for that secondary analysis. Often, the research briefs, too, have a smaller sample size. But the research briefs are incredibly important to going on to publishing that more scientifically rigorous manuscript, the research paper. We then also have qualitative research papers. These are papers that include possibly a methodology like focus groups or interviews. So this kind of qualitative research can be very important to research that is done where you might be getting additional quantitative kinds of numbers for a study that is, for example, a randomized clinical trial. It's important to keep in mind that we have checklists for each of these types of studies, and the checklists are very important to getting a publication in print as quickly as possible. So we're always very excited to see publications that have followed the checklist. We also have systematic reviews and narrative reviews. Each of those publications also have checklists and are very important to our readership in the Academy. There are case studies as well, which usually include a promising area for future research and may have a sample size of 1, for example. Commentaries then include emerging issues and often may have some controversial kinds of topics and are very important as our readership look at the kinds of research we may eventually see. And then we have editorials. They are usually done in conjunction with upcoming publications and are very important as we look at a body of literature. For example, one of the types of articles that we will be publishing very soon includes the Healthy Eating Index. And we have an editorial that will go along with 3 different publications that are focused on the Healthy Eating Index. The editorial provides a way of looking at research that may be a bit more controversial, or in some cases what the research editorial does is to allow for the kinds of situations where application is very important. So that indeed is very beneficial as we look at publications and various ways of viewing what we might see in a publication. Then the second question was about the general process. The general process that we follow in our work with accepting, or in some cases needing to modify what has been written, includes electronic submissions to EVIs initially. What happens once a publication is submitted to EVIs is that there is a review of that paper to be sure that the author guidelines are met. And the author guidelines include how closely a manuscript has followed the checklist, which I referred to earlier, and also a very close look at the general format that we are requesting, and also all of the pieces that need to go into a manuscript. We will often send manuscripts back to ask for a recheck once an article is submitted to us, and when an article is put out for review, there are a variety of ways in which reviewers are selected. We try in a very systematic fashion to identify who might be best in terms of peer review, and always try to be sure that reviewers are very much tied to whatever the topic might be. Either they have done research in that area, or they may have done a seminal publication in that area. And so that whole review process is one that is set up to allow for success for the author who has written the paper.
Right, yeah, that makes sense. So they're basically almost serving, they're anonymous generally, and they're almost serving as they're a reviewer, like you said, but they're a source of feedback that can be really constructive for the authors in trying to figure out how to best present what they did.
Very true.
Yeah. So then it sounds like even for all of us, regardless of how long you've been in research, you submit, like you said, you submit your manuscript to be published, and you do your best to follow the guidelines that are presented. But it sounds pretty normal that you might get some feedback from the reviewers and ways you can. There's always different ways you can improve your manuscript for publication. So in general, do you have any? What are some common pieces of feedback that people get? Some things that those listeners might be able to avoid during their publications.
I think probably one of the most often kinds of problems that we see in terms of publications that are turned in is that the guidelines just aren't followed. And so it's very important to read those guidelines and try to do as much as possible to follow the guidelines. And I know that sometimes may be difficult, but it really makes a huge difference in terms of what reviewers are seeing and how reviewers respond to a publication. And then additionally, it's important to be sure that if there is a certain kind of study design that's being used, that study design indeed fits with whatever the comments might be in the conclusions. We often see that there are comments made in the conclusions that really don't fit the study design, and that can cause a variety of problems in terms of just having kind of an out-of-sync eventual idea being proposed that really doesn't quite fit with what was done in terms of the research.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Making sure your conclusions are actually derived from your data.
Yes.
That makes sense. So, we have just a few minutes left in this part 5 here, and I'm wondering, some members may approach a research project with the sole purpose of studying an issue of importance to their specific workplace or setting. So should they also consider publishing their results or sharing their findings with a broader audience?
Yes, I think that the more we can do to take what is done in, for example, a clinical setting and study that in a rigorous way, the more likely we are to move our profession forward. And my thought is that one of the things we always need to keep in mind is that we want our results to be generalizable, so that if we are doing something in one setting, and this often happens with international research, we want to make sure that somewhere along the line within that manuscript there's a discussion about how to generalize the data to populations that could globally use the information. And sometimes that may be one of the reasons that we have some concerns about a publication if it just doesn't have that concept of generalizability.
So in regard to that concept, just to clarify potentially for our listeners, is it that the authors just need to be very clear about who they talk to and how that sample might relate to other people in similar settings? Are there any red flags that you guys might see in terms of someone trying to derive broader conclusions from too small of a setting or too unique of a setting, or is that still okay to try to publish?
I think that is something that can be publishable if there are aspects within the research that fit well with anything that might be done in another setting, so that there are always pieces of research that have methods, for example, that could be used in any setting, in any place, anywhere, but that indeed provide additional information that may be new, information that may indeed be unusual for a certain setting, but possibly can apply to many other settings. So if we're looking at something like malnutrition in one area, being sure that we have included the nuances that may be apparent in one population versus another population. And just by being very careful and very thoughtful in those areas, I think one can take a very specific kind of idea and make it something that everyone can understand.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been very helpful, Dr. Snetselaar. So thank you again for sharing your time and experience with us today and for being a part of this series. We're at the end of part 5, but thank you so much.